Okay, likewise, I'll set my alarm here too for 15 minutes because we need the liberty to speak our minds, but we need constraints, right, for order. So thanks everybody for coming to this event. I appreciate it. I'm glad that here at Northwood they're sponsoring this forum. I also should acknowledge that it takes courage for Mr. Erard to come here knowing he's probably the odd man out, as he says, so I do respect him for that. So let me sort of abuse my position here since I got to hear them go. Let me very quickly just respond to two main points they made just to showcase why I think the libertarian position is able to deal with the issues they're bringing up much more nimbly. And then I'll sort of go to my prepared remarks and try to give you the basic framework, the conceptual underpinning of my particular responses here. So I think what Nathan, Professor Schluter said here is one of his big things was the dissolution of marriage or the downfall of marriage. And so right there, I think that's a great example. That's like libertarian exhibit A in terms of showing how faulty government policies promote social decline. So in particular, I think there's great empirical evidence, the case to be made. I know Thomas Sowell talks about this a lot, that, for example, the black nuclear family was actually stronger than their white counterparts in the early 1900s. You might not have expected that, right, with the legacy of slavery and then later, restriction, segregation, and Jim Crow and so forth. But that was historically the case. But now, of course, like the rate of, what used to be called illegitimacy, now they just mean like a single mother raising children in a household, that is much higher in minority communities than in white counterparts. And you see it statistically that it has to do with the so-called war on poverty, where the government began paying women if they didn't have, they would get a bigger check if they had more children and they didn't have a spouse. Okay, and so it's not some crazy, nut job economic theory to say when you pay someone for something, you see more of that. Now, it's not, just to be clear, when we talk like this, the hypothesis is not that some 18-year-old young woman is sitting at home and like running calculators and doing computations and present discounted value flows and then saying, oh, this is the optimal thing for my, but no, it's more that like if she's in a relationship and gets pregnant, whereas back in the day, they probably would have gotten married. Now they don't need to do that. And particularly if it's not a guy that, she otherwise would have wanted to marry in the first place, because now it's feasible. You can get by. You don't need to go back home and move in with your parents. You can get by because the government starts sending you checks, right? So that's the idea. And then Mr. Erard he spent a lot of time focusing on the fact that, under modern wage slavery of the capitalist system, you as a worker, you spend some of your day with the socially necessary labor. You're kind of working, for yourself, but then there's a big chunk of your time that's spent as surplus labor that's, being skimmed off the top by this external exploitive factor. And as we're, recording this, folks, right now, it's April 17th, and the libertarian would say, yes, exactly, but it's not the capitalists, it's the IRS, right? And so, yes, I agree with a lot of the features of what these two are going to be saying ails our modern society, but I would say the problem is not the particulars they're going to point their finger at. It's more that with a lot of these issues, we can show how it's the modern state and it's, exceeding its rightful duties that is the cause, or at least a very large exacerbating factor. Okay, so let me now sort of take a step back, just as I give you two specific examples of how a libertarian would respond to the types of critiques they just leveled, or their diagnosis of what ails society. Let me just try to give you more of a systematic framework. And so here, I think, is where the libertarian really shines vis-a-vis some of these other perspectives, because I think what libertarianism fundamentally is an analysis or a prescription for the proper role of the state. Okay, and the reason I'm saying the state, in case that language is unfamiliar to you, think of it like with a capital S. I'm not saying the more familiar government with a small g, because in certain circumstances, government could mean like the family or a church. Like if you go to a church and there's elders and they can vote to kick somebody out, like some guy's cheating on his wife, and the elders pull him aside and say, you got to stop. And he says, no, mind your own business. They can just kick him. So a lot of people might say that's the government of the church. So that's not what I mean. That's why I'm explicitly meaning what we have in mind. If we say like, oh yeah, the government took money out of my paycheck, you know what I'm talking about. But the more precise terminology in this literature would be like the state. So that's why I'm using that term. So the idea being like, what is it that the state has the authority to do. And what's interesting is all three of us have held up what's called the classical liberal tradition as sort of our heritage. And now, we sort of have branched off. So that's true that we all like things that came out of the classical liberal tradition. And so today's libertarians are going to say, no, we're the rightful heirs, and the conservatives say they are, and the socialists say they are. So a classic text in this, and by the way, with some of these, because I know this is sort of like an introductory presentation, I'm going to be giving some classic readings in this just in case, here I've got 9.5 minutes left. I'm not going to make the decisive case for libertarianism, but I want to just whet your appetite, and then I'll give you ideas for further reading. So here, the classic work is Frederick Bastiat's The Law. That came out in 1850. You can go Google it. It's online for free. It's even translated into English to make it easier in case you don't speak French. And there, he made the basic case that, so he was what we might call a minarchist today. He wasn't an anarchist, that he believed that there was a role for the government or the state, the police and the military and so on. But he thought there's nothing that what's his justification? How does the state arise, at least if it's to do so legitimately? It's that people in their natural condition have certain liberties and rights, and one of them is the right to self-defense, right? So if I own a house and some land and some people come onto my property and I say, get off, and they say no, I can take out a sword or a gun and say, get out and shoot them if they don't leave. But of course, just on one-off interactions, a lot of people, you don't have the power to do that. If there's a gang that shows up, you're kind of helpless. And so Bastiat's idea was people form together, and that's what a government is people delegate what they have the natural right to do to some other group and give them the authority to act on their behalf because of just technological, pragmatic reasons. A lot of times that's more effective. But his point was, if that's what you think where government comes from, at least if it's to be legitimate or just, the government can't do things that would be illegitimate for you to do yourself. You can't delegate powers that you don't yourself possess. And so, for example, so Bastiat had this whole section on what he called legalized plunder. And his idea was, just even if we agree that, it would be nice to have soup kitchens or, relief for the unemployed, the government can't just take money from the public at large through taxation and then fund soup kitchens and so on, because you as an individual, you have the right to give your own money. You see someone destitute or hungry, you can certainly help the person, but you can't go down to your neighbor and say, hey, I'm going to kick in some money. I think you should too, to fund the soup kitchen. And if your neighbor says, no, I don't think so, you can't just take money at gunpoint from your neighbor because you think it's a good cause. And so if none of us can do that individually, how come if we all come together and have a vote and 62% say it, why all of a sudden is that legitimate? All right, so that's Bastiat's point. Another classic work in this tradition would be Ludwig von Mises. So he had a book called Liberalism that came out in 1927. Again, you can go get the PDF of this online. And so and Mises was an economist, and he's famous, as Nathan alluded to. He had a critique of socialism, which I might get to in a few minutes here. But besides just his work as an economist, Mises also was an expositor of the classical liberal tradition, and he made the point here, besides just like defense of property rights and things like that, that the liberal also was for peace, that he was saying ultimately the only way we get the benefits of private property and market economies and the prosperity that we all seem to see goes hand in hand with that is that you can't have warfare. That yes, in extreme cases that might be necessary if some aggressive nations coming in, you got to repel them. But the classical liberal knows that the standard should be peace among nations. That's the only thing conducive to general prosperity. And then because of that, an offshoot was Mises supported democracy, because he thought that was the way to avoid civil war, right? That he's saying we've got competing factions domestically. Ultimately, Mises thought the regime that's in power is the one that enjoys public support. And so he said there's no such thing in the long run as an unpopular government, because he meant ultimately the people will overthrow it. And so his point was, the slogan would be ballots instead of bullets, that if you give the people the vote and they can have a peaceful transition of power, that's the way you avoid periodic civil wars. Whereas like under monarchy or other forms of government, Mises argued, if the people don't like the regime, they have no choice but to overthrow it with force, and we don't want that. Okay. A major work that going from classical liberal to now clearly libertarian would be Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, which came out in 1973. And there, the central principle is the non-aggression principle, right? So before I was saying under Bastiat, the idea was that people can form a government to more efficiently perform tasks of like self-defense and, including the military. So in that conception, yes, there's a role for the state, but it's really just about, preventing contract violations and things like that. But otherwise, once the rules of the game are set up, everything is voluntary in that framework. And the state just kind of acts as a referee. Rothbard and For New Liberty, he has what's called the non-aggression principle, which in modern libertarian circles is pretty popular. And so that's just saying it's immoral to initiate aggression against somebody else. And most people in the abstract think, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I agree with that. But in practice, it has a lot of implications, right? So for example, if someone's a heroin addict, you might think they're making a mistake with their life. You might say, no kid of mine living under my roof is going to use heroin, or I'm kicking them out. You can do that. Certainly, you have the libertarian right to do that because it's your property, but you can't point a gun at somebody else and say, if I catch you using heroin again, I'm going to shoot you, or I'm going to throw you in a cage. And yet that's what drug prohibition means. Okay, so that's the sense in which Rothbard takes this principle that at first blush seems pretty non-controversial and yet reaches pretty radical conclusions, including there are some libertarians that actually are anarchists. Rothbard was one, and he called himself an anarcho-capitalist because he thought you can even privatize services. So not just privatize the roads and the schools, but even the police and the military. So I'm just warning you that that's in that strain. So for the rest of tonight's panel, I'm not gonna, I'll try to stick to what most libertarians agree with, and so I won't be defending particular positions that only some do. But I just want to show you that that's in that strain where he thought those principles led. So again, notice just all of this is saying what is the proper scope of government, and so it's making sure the means are legitimate. So I think both of the other panelists tonight, they're going to be talking about all the good things they want to do in society, but the central point for the libertarian is if you don't have the right to do, you can't. The ends don't justify the means, right? That's to put it simply. Okay, so I think partly to explain why the libertarian view is so robust and useful is you just have to know some history. So if you've never seen it, a chart of like per capita economic output is like this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then like in the 1700s, 1800s, it just goes like that. And it's particularly concentrated like in what we call now the West. And so why is that? And I believe that historians and economic historians and others have convincingly demonstrated that a necessary part of that story was the recognition of and respect for individual rights, limited government, private property, and so forth, the things that are associated with the libertarian conception of the state. A good book on this is Capitalism and the Historians by Friedrich Hayek, and also Bert Folsom, who I know visited your guys' campus earlier this year. He's also got a great little booklet called The Myth of the Robber Barons. So just showing that a lot of maybe what you've been taught about how awful the Industrial Revolution was and people used to be free and happy running around the fields and they had to go work in these dirty factories. No, the reason that people flocked to the cities to go to the factories is they got paid more than they did, working 16-hour days out in the fields. Okay, so that's part of the issue there. Just empirically, we've got some, there's no such thing as a true controlled experiment in the social sciences, but you've got East versus West Germany, North versus South Korea. The liberalization that occurred under China, clearly life is better for the average Chinese person than it was under Mao. Okay, so you have clear-cut examples of similar cultures where one's, socialist or communist, you want to call it, and capitalist. So I think in general, it's pretty obvious that capitalism per se is better than socialism as far as economic output, and also some of the things that Mr. Erard was talking about, like autonomy to evade top-down central planning and micromanagement of your life. I mean, there was nothing more horrifying in terms of top-down control of your life than under regimes that were socialist. So, I guess, he's probably going to get up and argue, well, that wasn't true socialism, or that's not the socialism we wanted. But just in general, if you had to randomly pick a capitalist country or a socialist country from the 20th century to be plopped into, not only are you going to have a higher standard of living, but your freedom of your own individual life is going to be much higher statistically under a capitalist choice. The fundamental issue here, just to conclude, it comes down to incentives and competence, right? So That's the basic theory here, is like, as an economist, to explain why is it that there seems to be this correlation between limited government and nice outcomes, including a large economy, but also individual personal freedom. And just think about it, just in general, if you have somebody that's going to be doing something for you and having control or influence on your life, they need to have the right incentives to do the right thing, and they have to have the competence to do it. And with free markets and individual choice, you're much more likely to get that. If the government comes in to do something, you're not going to have those. So just end with this. Would you want to have an election where there's a campaign and different candidates vie for votes, and then the winner gets to do, like, to be your car mechanic, or to choose what apartment you have to live in, or to pick the person you're going to go on a date with next week, right? I think in all those circumstances, that would be absolutely terrifying, right? Just to think it through, to make it real. Like, imagine if that were the case, and you could say, well, no, if somebody was a bad date, then you could just lobby for the next election, or if somebody was a terrible car mechanic, eventually you could. But no, it's just so much better that you have the freedom and the ability just to change, take your business elsewhere, or not go on a second date with a person that you don't click with. Whereas if you had to go through the political process, that would be a nightmare. And yet for those fairly mundane things, we realize how crazy a system that would be to use the political process. But that's the way we're going to decide how much of our income gets taken, or who goes to prison because they're a drug addict, and so forth. So I'm just saying, it's not that the flaws with that system magically get fixed when the problems get really important. No, there's terrible things right now going on in society that they agree with, and I'm saying it's because the government is far too big and powerful. Thanks.